It's always been an interesting origin for the cemetery in that the graveyard at St Peter's Church just down the hill was filling up and spilling over onto the road. They wanted to find a bigger, more generous space for burying the dead of Berkhamsted, and the Countess of Bridgewater up at Ashridge, she very kindly donated the land, and then since that point it's always been money raised by public subscription, which has helped with the extensions of the cemetery as well. There's always been a public interest in the cemetery. It was a pretty derelict and neglected site. There were walls collapsing, the entrance gate piers were nearly falling over. The squatters had been occupying the sexton's hut for a while, so the door had to be blocked up and it wasn't accessible. We set out to try and transfer it from a dead space to a living place. I'm very pleased with the fact that we seem to have arrived at that point where it's accessible, they can see what's been done as a result of the project, and they can feel welcome and invited into the space. We managed to secure a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. That paid for a substantial proportion of the works, but we also had to raise probably $250,000 on top of that as partnership funding. So we've had to evolve different types of fundraising techniques to really get that extra money as part of the process. It was absolute key to the project to understand what was important. We didn't want to try and put it back to what it was originally. What we've done is try and find a real balance between what's historic, what's original. Areas where, for instance, there weren't any gravestones were ideal places to put the Garden of Remembrance and the performance canopy. We did a lot of work to try and understand how the cemetery had developed historically, and out of that came this concept to divide the site into 3 zones that reflected that historical development. The area where we're setting it now is the oldest part of the cemetery. That always had quite a nice parkland feel to it, so we've designated that an events and activities area. The middle area with the Garden of Remembrance was very much an area for memorialisation, which is where the adopt-a-grave scheme is particularly strong. What we've done is deliberately set aside at least a third of the cemetery as a wildlife area. It's been great to find out that there's various types of bumblebees that we didn't know we had. The flora and fauna is all expanding. And also one of our kind neighbours has been up every morning keeping an eye on what kind of birds are here in the cemetery, and we've put in bird boxes and things to encourage them as well. The project itself really fell into 2 parts, and we deliberately did that because the first phase was looking at the conservation of all the elements of the site that had been neglected. And that particular part of the work really required specialists in certain areas like memorial restoration, rebuilding, brickwork in lime mortar, etc. We've had quite a range of people with different skills involved. One of the things that happened as a result of the memorial restoration was that we managed to take on a trainee apprentice who lived locally. We also paid for him to do his training at college, and now he's a fully trained memorial mason and does a lot of our restoration work here. One of the key pieces of work was to try and straighten the gate piers at the entrance on Rectory Lane. They were about to topple over. They actually undermined piers completely, brought in bottle jacks and straightened the piers themselves, so they now are all perfectly aligned. The memorial arch was leaning over towards the upper part of the cemetery. The stonework was crumbling, so we replaced some of the stonework, and the inscription had faded as well. So Will Yendall, our apprentice stonemason, he recarved the inscriptions, which now look very crisp and are readable. The sexton's hut is a little building on the boundary of the site which was used by the sexton, and he used to sit in there and drink his tea and smoke his pipe and keep all his tools in there as well. And that had obviously been completely left and abandoned when the graveyard stopped being used as a graveyard in the 1940s. So once we'd opened it up, we used the sexton's hut when we undertake interment of ashes. It's also a nice little space for storytelling, and it also has a small exhibition in it about the project itself. The second phase, which was the landscaping work, we involved a company mainly composed of people who all live locally, but who were just brilliant at landscaping works. 2019-20 winter of that was actually one of the wettest on record. The place looked for a short time like the Somme, and then we were struck with COVID-19 and the site was closed. Works stopped for about a month, but the site itself was closed for probably 10 months. Happily, that didn't affect the timing and the budget of the project, and we completed on time. One of the major tasks really was putting in the resin-bound gravel paths. We followed historically what had been there. We didn't create extra pathways in the cemetery. One of the things for us was that although burials had mainly stopped in the 1940s, there was the opportunity to look at whether it could be a place for interment of ashes. So we've reopened that possibility with the Garden of Remembrance. The use of the memorial tiles is a really lovely way for people to come in and commemorate people or commemorate events. It's not just people who've passed away, it's designed to be for living people as well. I think that's a pleasant way of being able to continue the spirit of the cemetery into the future. I think it's true to say that we set out to achieve a whole range of outcomes with the Heritage Lottery funding. There are more things on site than we'd set out to do. We've got a lovely performance canopy for open air events. We've got a nice volunteer retreat where the volunteers can go. One of the nice outcomes of the project has been that families have realised that it's now being looked after, and they now have actually come forward and said, oh, we'd like to restore our memorials, we'd like to restore our graves. So we're kind of growing the interest in the cemetery simply by restoring it. It's a space that opens up all sorts of opportunities for people to come and enjoy. We can do yoga activities, we can do Pilates for art courses, photography courses. We set out to show that cemeteries didn't need to be dead spaces. Actually, perhaps we've been a little bit forgetful about what these spaces are close to the centres of towns. They have this terrific opportunity to be open spaces again, which people can enjoy, and that provides that engagement with the whole town as well.